Greetings, my fellow knights. Tonight we uncover the secret history of alchemy, where science, mystery, and the quest for eternal wisdom intertwined. But before you drift into comfort, I ask you to like and subscribe, and in the comments, share what legends or myths you would have us ride toward next. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1. Crucibles of Alexandria. Alchemy's earliest clear traces appeared in Hellenistic and Roman Egypt, where craft knowledge, temple ritual, and philosophical speculation met in a shared pursuit of material change. The activity later called alchemy took shape within workshops that handled metals, dyes, and glass, and within texts that blended technical instructions with reflections on nature. Greek writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus offered a language for speaking about the hidden powers of matter, while recipe books recorded practical steps for coloring and transforming substances. Early authors such as Zosimos of Panopolis gathered these strands into treatises that described furnaces, vessels, and sequences of operations. The resulting literature treated metals, minerals, and corrosive solutions as materials that could be cleansed, cooked, and brought to new states. It presented change as a process that could be guided if the artisan understood order, timing, and heat. This synthesis did not form at once. It developed over centuries as artisans wrote down procedures, priests linked rites with craft, and writers adapted philosophical terms to laboratory routines. By the time late antique compilers worked, the outlines of a technical and reflective art had become visible. The setting stretched from the founding of Alexandria in the early Hellenistic period to late antiquity under Roman rule. Alexandria stood on the Mediterranean shore, tied to the Nile Delta and to inland towns by canals and roads. It had docks, warehouses, and markets that drew in copper, lead, natron, resins, and stones. It held libraries and schools, and relied on a large class of skilled workers. Workshops for metalworking, dyeing, glassmaking, and papyrus production clustered near the harbour and along canals. Temples and their dependencies, both in Alexandria and in older centres like Memphis and Thebes, maintained storerooms, laboratories, and ritual kitchens. Further south, Panopolis, known later as Achaemenum, supplied linen and hosted scribal and craft communities. In such environments, furnaces burned day and night, and vessels of clay and glass stood ready for roasting, melting, dissolving, and distilling. The climate allowed sun-drying and slow evaporation. Trade routes brought cinnabar, realgar, orpiment, and alum to the city, while local nectron and sand supported glassmaking. The combination of urban scale, craft tradition, and book culture made the region a natural home for recording and elaborating techniques of transformation. Key figures known from surviving texts created a chain of names that later writers treated as authorities. Zosimos of Panopolis, active around the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE, wrote in Greek and compiled both technical instructions and reflective passages on method. He cited earlier authors and commented on apparatus and operations. Maria the Jewess, also called Maria the Prophetessa, appeared as an expert artisan, credited with specific devices and techniques. The details of her life remained uncertain. The name Pseudo-Democritus referred to early Greek treatises on dyeing and metal coloring that used the prestige of the philosopher Democritus. Some scholars associated these with Bolos of Mendes. Cleopatra the alchemist appeared in late antique material titled Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra. The identity of this author remained unknown and had no secure link to the Ptolemaic queen. Ostanes and Agatha Diamond figured as legendary or semi-legendary authorities, often tied to Persian or Hellenistic wisdom traditions. Hermes Trismegistus functioned as a literary figure under whose name philosophical dialogues circulated. Artisans and priests worked in the background of these names, shaping the practices that the texts described. Scribes and compilers preserved, excerpted, and rearranged material, producing the mixtures of voices that the manuscripts recorded. The development of an alchemical craft began with established industries. Metal workers alloyed copper and tin, refined silver and lead, and manipulated surfaces to mimic the sheen of gold. Dyers used mordants to bind colours to wool and linen, and glassmakers blended sands, ash, and colorants into transparent vessels. From these traditions came recipes that exploited the behavior of mercury, sulfur, and arsenic compounds to etch and tint metal surfaces. Greek papyri from Roman Egypt, such as Leiden X and the Stockholm Papyrus, recorded procedures for gilding, silvering, and producing imitations. They described weights, grindings, heat treatments, and baths. They gave lists of ingredients including vinegar, natron, salt, vitriols, and copper filings. In temple settings, rituals of purification framed the handling of substances, priests maintained purity rules, and craft specialists observed protocols for timing and sequence. Meanwhile, philosophical texts in the Hermetic tradition spoke about the animation of nature, the role of pneuma, and the ordering of elements. Early compilers connected these perspectives by treating transformations of color and texture as signs of deeper changes. A long-standing report attributed to later writers claimed that the Emperor Diocletian ordered the destruction of Egyptian books on making gold and silver to prevent rebellion. The historicity of this report remained debated. Recounting or rejecting that story, authors nonetheless presented alchemical knowledge as selective and guarded. By late antiquity, Zosimos and others presented a clearer picture of apparatus and operations. Treatises described furnaces with adjustable vents, sand baths for gentle heat, and water baths for steady temperatures. They named vessels such as the Keratakis, a sealed device for heating substances and collecting condensates, and the Tribikos, a three-armed distillation setup. They discussed cucurbits, alembics, and receivers, many made from the glass that Alexandria produced in quantity. Texts outlined sequences like roasting, calcination, dissolving, distilling, subliming, coagulating, and tincting. They emphasized patient repetition, observation of color changes, and the management of vapors. Zosimus wrote of a divine water used to open metals. Its composition remained uncertain in modern scholarship. He linked the success of a procedure to the proper pairing of substance, vessel, and fire. He also inherited a symbolic vocabulary in which metals corresponded to planets and stages of work were marked by colors such as blackening, whitening, and reddening. The Chrysopoeia of Cleopatra included diagrams and the Ouroboros symbol, illustrating an attempt to unify practice and theory. From these combined efforts emerged a recognizable technical literature. It did not rely on a single doctrine but on a set of practices, instruments, and ways of describing change. The workshops supplied the tools, the texts supplied sequence and explanation, and the shared aim was a reproducible transformation of matter. Surviving witnesses to this world were fragmentary. Manuscripts had been copied, excerpted, and glossed across centuries, and many attributions remained uncertain. Some scholars stressed a continuity from Egyptian temple craft to Greek technical writings. Others emphasized the reshaping of practice through Hellenistic philosophical language. The origin of the term for the art, later rendered in Arabic as alchemia and in Greek as chemeia or chemeia, remained debated. The names of Maria the Jewess and Cleopatra the alchemist suggested female participation, but details about their lives could not be verified. Despite such gaps, the outlines of the Alexandrian crucible were clear. Artisans and authors created a body of recipes, devices, and concepts that treated materials as trainable through heat, time, and contact. They wrote with care about furnaces and fluids, they compared steps across procedures, and they valued secrecy and trust. These foundations formed the starting point for later readers. When texts traveled into new languages, the vessels, operations, and disciplined outlook that took shape in Hellenistic and Roman Egypt remained at the core, ready to be adapted to other settings and questions. Chapter 2. Baghdad's Translators and the Making of New Instrument. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad marked a turning point when Arabic scholars gathered, translated, and reworked older writings into a fresh practice of alchemy. Their efforts reorganized scattered craft lore and Greek theories into a coherent program of study and experiment. The translation movement produced new texts and a shared technical vocabulary. It also connected court physicians, philosophers, artisans, and instrument makers. Figures such as Jabir ibn Hayyan and al-Razi shaped procedures and apparatus that later readers recognized as central. They described furnaces, alembics, and retorts with care, and they linked laboratory action to theories of metals and mixtures. The Arabic corpus was large and diverse, including manuals, commentaries, and collections of recipes. Some writings were philosophical and allegorical, others were practical and procedural. Together they turned alchemical inquiry into a more systematic craft. Their work did not erase earlier traditions, but it changed the scale and method of experimentation. Through these efforts, alchemy entered new settings, gained new tools, and acquired a steady descriptive language that could be taught, copied, and adapted in many places. The setting lay in the Abbasid period, from the mid-8th to the 10th century, when Baghdad rose as a center of learning and administration across a vast territory. The House of Wisdom, or Beit al-Hikmah, functioned as a library, translation bureau, and workshop linked to the caliphal court. Its activity overlapped with schools, hospitals, and private libraries in cities such as Kufa, Basra, Ray, Damascus, and Cairo. Workshops for paper, glass, dyes, and metalwork supplied materials and skilled labor. Papermaking, adopted from East Asian techniques, supported the copying of long technical treatises. Translation teams drew on Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Indian sources, and artisans contributed practical knowledge rooted in local trades. The broader economy, with caravan and maritime routes, moved minerals, salts, and equipment between regions. The climate and available fuels influenced furnace construction and the choice of vessels. Court patronage stabilized projects over many years. Seasonal rhythms and urban routines set the pace of work, from collecting substances to firing kilns and writing reports. The daily life of laboratories unfolded among scribes, translators, physicians, and craftsmen, each bringing specialized skills to shared rooms and benches. The principal figures included Jabir ibn Hayyan and al-Razi, whose names anchored large bodies of writing and practice. Jabir was associated with a corpus that explored the composition of metals, the theory of balance, and the preparation of elixirs. The dates and biography of Jabir remained uncertain in later sources, but the corpus circulated widely under his name. Al-Razi, also known as Rhazes, worked as a physician and wrote practical guides to substances, apparatus, and operations. He directed a hospital in Rayy and later in Baghdad, and he organized materials by their behavior under heat and solvents. Other influential contributors included Al-Kindi, who studied perfumes and distillation, and Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a translator who moved medical and philosophical texts from Greek and Syriac into Arabic. The Banu Musa, a family of scholars and patrons, supported instrument making and translated mechanical works. Caliphs such as Al-Mamun sponsored the House of Wisdom and called for systematic translation projects. These individuals interacted through patronage networks, correspondence, and shared tools. Their relationships linked textual learning and hands-on craft, and they supplied alchemy with both theoretical frameworks and reliable equipment. The translation movement set up procedures that brought older knowledge into Arabic and then adapted it for new use. Teams selected manuscripts, prepared glossaries, and tested obscure terms against workshop practice. Words for vessels, furnaces, and operations gained precise meanings. Translators and scholars described the ambics, which became the Arabic ambique and later alembic, and they detailed the paired vessels that allowed vapors to rise and condense. Glassblowers shaped cucurbits, receivers and beakers with forms suited to repeated heating. Descriptions of furnaces clarified the management of airflow, fuel, and heat gradients. Lists of operations stabilized the sequence of distillation, calcination, sublimation, solution, crystallization, and coagulation. Jabir's writings developed a sulfur-mercury account of metals that explained differences in color, malleability, and weight by varying proportions and purities. He also discussed a concept of balance, or mizan, which treated properties as measurable tendencies that could be adjusted by process. Al-Razi catalogued materials used by alchemists and physicians. He set apart volatile spirits, such as mercury, sulfur, and sal ammoniac, from fixed substances such as metals and certain salts. He described reagents by their action, noting which corroded, which colored, and which cleansed. These efforts led to new procedures and outcomes that shaped later practice. Al-Razi's manuals presented apparatus with attention to joints, luting, and safety, which supported longer runs of distillation and sublimation. Descriptions of water baths and sand baths set gentle and moderate heat levels for delicate separations. Repeated distillation produced stronger aromatic waters and more refined oils. Controlled roasting and washing yielded purer vitriols and alums. Sal ammoniac, obtained from certain mineral or organic sources, became a key reagent in dissolving metals and in sublimation sequences. Craftsmen applied these methods to pigments, metal plating, and colored glass, and physicians adapted purified compounds for topical and internal remedies. Jabir's corpus linked such operations to a gradual transformation theory, in which repeated adjustment of dryness, moisture, heat, and coldness moved a substance toward a desired state. Writers described color changes as indicators that a stage had been reached, and they recorded simple tests for texture, odor, and weight. The resulting notes circulated in copies annotated by readers, and the procedures were practiced in workshops attached to courts and markets. Over time, these records established a pattern for stepwise work that others could follow and check. The culture of Arabic alchemy varied across regions and decades, and many texts survived in different recensions. Later scholars debated the identity and date of Jabir, and they evaluated which parts of the corpus were early and which were later. Some treatises attributed to Al-Razi circulated in multiple versions, and authorship of certain works remained uncertain. A neutral statement suffices where sources did not agree. Despite such variations, the Arabic movement stabilized a common toolbox and a clear language of operations. It integrated ancient theories with local craft techniques, and it described instruments and tests in ways that readers could reproduce. The House of Wisdom stood as a symbol of this synthesis. Even as work continued in hospitals, homes, and shops beyond its walls, the new instruments and methods then moved outward along the same routes that had once carried the manuscripts inward, setting the stage for later translations and adaptations that would carry the craft into new languages and lands. Chapter 3. Translators, Scribes, and the Making of Latin Alchemy. Latin transmissions described how Arabic alchemy entered medieval Europe through translations in the 12th and 13th centuries. and how Latin authors reframed it for scholastic readers. The movement involved not only the conversion of language, but also the shaping of concepts for new audiences who valued order, proof, and commentary. Translators rendered terms for substances, apparatus, and operations into Latin, and their choices guided later readers toward certain interpretations. Compilers and teachers then organized these materials into treatises that matched the structure of university discourse. Within this flow, a distinctive Latin alchemical idiom took form, blending craft knowledge with the categories of Aristotelian natural philosophy. The corpus that resulted preserved much of the Arabic content and also introduced new emphases, especially on systematic procedure and precise proportions. Through this process, figures writing under Latin names, including the author known as Pseudo-Geber, defined a program for laboratory practice that endured for centuries. The chapter traced the paths of texts, the hands that moved them, and the settings that gave them authority. It showed how alchemy moved from a foreign archive into a readable body of Latin doctrine and experiment, and how that body supported later developments in European craft and science. The setting extended from translation centers in the Iberian Peninsula and Sicily to the manuscript rooms of monasteries and the lecture halls of emerging universities. In Toledo, where Arabic, Latin, and vernacular communities lived near one another, teams of translators worked between about 1140 and 1180 to render technical and philosophical works into Latin. In Palermo and Naples, the court of Frederick II in the early 13th century brought scholars who could consult Greek and Arabic sources and who appreciated practical arts alongside philosophy. Medical schools in Salerno and Montpellier provided readers trained to use new texts on drugs and distillates. Cathedral schools and early universities at Paris and Oxford, active across the 13th century, supplied a framework in which natural philosophy and its commentaries shaped expectations for argument and demonstration. Scribes in scriptoria copied fresh translations into portable codices, sometimes bundling alchemical recipes with treatises on medicine, astrology, and metallurgy. Trade routes between the Mediterranean and northern Europe carried these books and the materials they described, such as alum, vitriol, and saltpeter. Through these routes, the technical vocabulary of alchemy entered Latin, alongside tools and substances, and the discipline found new communities of readers and practitioners. Principal figures included translators, compilers, and scholastic writers, who acted at different points in the chain. Robert of Chester translated an Arabic text in 1144, known in Latin as the Liber de Compositione Alchemiae, which introduced the terms alchemia and elixir to many Latin readers. Gerard of Cremona, active in Toledo, produced numerous translations in medicine and astronomy, and helped establish a technical register that other translators adopted. John of Seville, also working in Iberia, transmitted practical writings and framed them with Latin headings and divisions that aided study. At the court of Frederick II, Michael Scott translated works of Aristotle and Averroes, and writings circulated under his name connected celestial influences to mineral generation. In the later 13th century, the author known as Pseudo-Geber composed the Summa Perfectionis and related treatises, which presented alchemy as a rigorous art grounded in mineral reagents and defined operations. The author's exact identity was unknown. Scholastic masters such as Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon discussed alchemy within broader inquiries into nature and experiment. Arnold of Villanova promoted medical distillates and linked alchemical manipulation to pharmacy. The name of Ramon Lull appeared on many alchemical texts, though their authorship remained debated and was often pseudonymous. Key events began with the organized work of translation in the mid-12th century. In 1144, Robert of Chester rendered an Arabic epistle into Latin that described the art of alchemia through dialogues attributed to Maurienus and Khalid. That text carried a tone of instruction combined with spiritual counsel and established a precedent for Latin discussions of metallic transformation. Soon after, translators in Toledo and elsewhere drew on Arabic compilations attributed to Jabir ibn Hayyan and al-Razi, creating Latin treatises on bodies, spirits, metals, salts, and alumina. These works introduced classifications of substances and defined operations such as calcination, solution, sublimation, and coagulation in terms that Latin readers could follow. As scribes copied the translations, compilers assembled recipe collections that joined dyeing, metallurgy, and medicinal preparations with alchemical aims. The Secret of Secrets, a pseudo-Aristotelian mirror for princes, circulated with sections on chemistry of minerals and waters, giving a royal frame to practical arts. Over the next decades, the Latin vocabulary solidified around words like alembic, alkali, and alcohol, each adapted from Arabic roots. These terms made it possible to describe apparatus and reactions with new clarity, and they prepared readers to imagine controlled, repeatable procedures. Development continued as scholastic settings shaped how alchemy was argued and taught. The Pseudo-Geber corpus, written in the later 13th century, set a model of precision in apparatus, reagents and steps. The Summa Perfection is described the preparation of strong mineral acids, including aqua fortis from saltpeter and vitriol, and the compounding of aqua regia by mixing such acids with sal ammoniac. It emphasized purity of materials, proportional mixtures, and staged operations under measured heat. It recast earlier sulfur-mercury theories into a more technical framework and hinted at corpuscular explanations for metallic change. Masters at Paris and Oxford read alchemical claims alongside Aristotle's physics and meteorology, comparing ideas of matter, form, and generation. Albertus Magnus considered the limits of transmutation within an Aristotelian account of metallic formation, while Roger Bacon affirmed the value of experiment and separated reliable trial from rumour. Arnold of Villanova adapted distillation law to medical aims and gave authority to pharmacy within the same learned milieu. Manuscript circulation widened across Italy, France, and England, and scribes marked headings and diagrams that clarified laboratories for readers who had never seen them. By 1300, Latin alchemy possessed a stable set of texts, terms, and procedures that encouraged systematic work at the furnace. Context showed variation and uncertainty that were typical of medieval book cultures. Many attributions were pseudonymous, and families of manuscripts preserved divergent readings of steps and ingredients. The precise provenance of several translations remained uncertain. Treatises such as the Liber de Illuminibus et Salibus circulated with different claims of authorship, and compilers often combined chapters from multiple sources. Some readers favored the Maurienist tradition that stressed moral discipline alongside technique, while others preferred the tighter protocols of the pseudo-Geber writings. The integration of alchemy into university life remained informal. It was not a formal faculty subject, yet its texts entered commentaries and disputations on nature. Courts and workshops also absorbed selected recipes, especially where metallurgy, dyeing, and saltpeter refining grew important. The Latin renderings created an enduring bridge between earlier Arabic authorities and later European practice, and they left a literature that trained readers to think about furnaces, vessels, and signs with orderly care. With these transmissions in place, the stage was set for a closer look at the fires, glassware, and notations that organized practical alchemical work in the centuries that followed. Chapter 4. Fires, Vessels, and Signs of the Working Art Laboratory Furnaces. Glassware, operating sequences, and symbolic notations formed the practical backbone of alchemy. The craft relied on controlled heat, sealed vessels, and a shared vocabulary of signs to describe materials and steps. Over centuries, workers developed a toolkit that allowed them to concentrate, separate, and recombine substances with some regularity. Furnaces supplied steady or intense fires as needed. Glass and ceramic vessels contained pastes, solutions, and vapors. Written characters marked metals, salts, and operations in a compact way on page and margin. These features did not fix outcomes, but they helped practitioners repeat procedures and compare results. When recipes moved between languages, the equipment and symbols anchored the instructions. The interplay between fire, vessel, and sign shaped how alchemists planned, recorded, and judged their work. The earliest form of several notations is not known. What became stable was a rhythm of heating, cooling, dissolving, and drying that recurred across schools and regions. Through this shared material culture, alchemical practice developed recognizable routines that could be taught, adapted, and remembered. Workrooms appeared in cities, monasteries, palaces, and artisan quarters from late antiquity through the early modern period. The spaces held hearths or built furnaces with clay chimneys and vents. Benches carried mortars, balances, and an array of flasks. A corner might hold a water bath warmed by a small fire. Another corner might house a sand bath or ash bath to spread heat evenly. Floors were often brick or packed earth to tolerate spills and embers. Storage jars contained minerals, salts, gums, and metallic filings. Bellows rested by larger furnaces for brief blasts of air. Shelves held manuscript books or bound notebooks with notes and signs. Light entered through small windows, but much of the work took place by the glow of the fire. Urban workshops had easier access to fuel, glass, and metalware. Rural or monastic sites tended to repurpose kitchen spaces or herbal still rooms. Exact layouts varied widely. The plan of a typical alchemical workspace in the earliest periods is unknown. What remained common was the pairing of a reliable heat source with vessels that could endure and transmit that heat without failing. A few named figures became linked with tools and methods. Maria the Jewess, known from late antique and early medieval sources, was cited for the Balneum Mariae, a gentle water bath, and for multi-neck distillation heads. Zosimos of Panopolis described vessels and the hazards of overheating, and later readers extracted apparatus lore from his writings. In the Islamic world, Al-Razi wrote on glassware shapes and the uses of distillation and sublimation, listing vessels and their purposes. The Latin corpus attributed to Pseudo-Geber offered furnace types and operational terms that influenced later scholastic readers. Albertus Magnus discussed minerals and the effects of fire on them in a way that guided furnace practice. In the 16th century, Vannocchio Biringuccio and Georgius Agricola illustrated furnaces and metallurgical setups, while Andreas Libavius compiled apparatus and procedures in a systematic textbook. These figures did not act as a single school, but their writings connected names to tools and gave later workers points of reference. Their lists and diagrams placed devices, materials, and steps into a shared frame that apprentices could learn. Furnaces were built for distinct tasks. The ethanol provided a slow, even heat for long operations. A wind furnace took advantage of drafts and bellows for higher temperatures. Reverberatory furnaces sent flames over the top of a vessel to reflect heat back. Cupellation hearths supported lead assays and separation of precious metals. Sand and ash baths moderated heat around flasks. Balneum Mariae placed vessels in warm water for gentle digestion. Glassware included the cucurbit as a lower vessel, the alembic as a cap to collect vapors, and the receiver as a side or separate collection flask. Retorts combined vessel and neck for direct distillation without a separate head. Condensing tubes, straight or coiled, carried vapors to cooled receivers when materials required it. Luting mixtures of clay, ash, and sometimes organic binders sealed joints and protected against leaks. Workers gauged heat by the color of the furnace mouth and the behavior of the material, using terms like gentle, open, and strong fire. They planned runs of calcination to ash metallic compounds, sublimation to carry solids into crystalline deposits, and distillation to concentrate waters and spirits. The sequence and timing depended on the intended product and the stability of the material under heat. Signs and operations made up a second layer of practice. Planetary symbols marked the 7 common metals: gold with the sun, silver with the moon, copper with Venus, iron with Mars, tin with Jupiter, lead with Saturn, and quicksilver with Mercury. Many manuscripts used compact marks for sulfur, salt, and sal ammoniac. Common operations appeared as words and sometimes as shorthand marks for solution, coagulation, fixation, and projection. Notations varied by region and period. Some signs shifted meaning over time. The first use of several symbols cannot be dated precisely. Despite variation, the habit of condensing materials and steps into signs allowed recipes to fit in margins and tables. As glassmaking improved, stronger flasks and better joints allowed distillation of stronger waters. Nitric acid from vitriols and saltpeter, and hydrochloric acid from salt and vitriol became routine. Aqua regia formed by combining suitable acids, dissolved gold, and demanded glass and glaze that could survive its bite. Printed books added woodcuts of furnaces and vessels, guiding construction and repair. Balances and weights helped workers measure charges before and after operations, and cupels tested outcomes in small trials. Methods grew more precise, but they still depended on the steady management of fire, vessel, and seal. Variations in language and craft shaped how tools and signs were named. The same furnace might be called by different terms in Arabic, Latin, or vernacular texts. The same symbol could stand for a metal in one region and for a salt in another. Printers sometimes modified glyphs for clarity, which created new variants. Some workshops preferred ceramic ware and avoided glass for corrosive distillations. Others invested in glass and used luting sparingly. None of these differences erased the shared structure of practice. Across settings, heat was graded, vessels were chosen for resilience or reactivity, and marks on paper held the plan. The material culture trained attention to changes of color, odor, and texture, and the notational culture made those changes legible for memory and exchange. Through ordinary furnaces, sturdy vessels, and practical signs, alchemists framed their experiments in a stable routine that could be carried forward to new aims and new claims. Chapter 5. Courts, guilds, and the guarded doors of the art. Patronage and secrecy formed the working boundaries of alchemical life. Support from rulers, magistrates, and guilds gave access to furnaces, metals, and time. Oversight by the same authorities set limits, demanded proofs, and punished deception. Recipes and procedures moved through this landscape under protection and restraint. Courts offered rooms, stipends, and mines, but they also required demonstrations and reports. City guilds fixed standards for assaying and controlled entry to crafts that overlapped with alchemy, such as metalworking, dyeing, and pharmacy. Licenses opened doors for experiments that tested coinage or produced novel substances. Statutes and ecclesiastical decrees narrowed claims that touched money or salvation. Written instructions stayed coded or partial to secure advantage and avoid charges of fraud. The survival of a practitioner's livelihood depended on relationships, documents, and careful speech. Successful workers balanced promises with proof and guarded their methods within trusted circles. Failures or overbold claims brought interrogation. In this way, institutions shaped which experiments were possible, who could attempt them, and how results circulated. The guarded nature of recipes was not an ornament, but a practical response to opportunity and risk. These social arrangements framed the craft as much as any furnace or vessel. Settings ranged from royal residences and episcopal palaces to urban guild halls and mint houses. Medieval and early modern courts in Prague, Florence, and London hosted laboratories near treasuries and cabinet rooms. Mining towns in Central Europe supplied ores and salts, and their assayers monitored yields. Venetian workshops handled glass, glazes, and salts under tight civic rules. Urban centres such as Nuremberg, Paris, and Antwerp brought printers, instrument makers, and goldsmiths into close proximity. Rural monasteries and noble estates maintained smaller workrooms where distillation and metallurgical trials proceeded away from city scrutiny. Documents of patronage and control lay in chancery registers, guild ordinances, and mint ledgers. When the setting was a court, movements and expenditures left traces in household accounts. When work happened under guild privileges, records preserved names of masters and the rules they swore. Many workshops left no narrative of daily practice. Where evidence was absent, the physical routines of heat, separation, and assay likely continued in similar surroundings. The geography of patronage followed trade routes, mining districts, and administrative centres. The geography of secrecy followed the walls and keys of rooms, the oaths of officials, and the discipline of closed crafts. The principal figures included patrons, gatekeepers, and practitioners. Patrons were princes, magistrates, bishops, and wealthy merchants who funded work and expected gains in bullion, remedies, or prestige. Gatekeepers were officials at mints and treasuries, guild wardens of goldsmiths and apothecaries, and clerical authorities concerned with fraud and doctrine. Practitioners included itinerant projectors who promised transmutation, resident court alchemists who managed labs and stores, and craft masters who applied chemical methods to dyeing, gilding, or medical distillation. Emperor Rudolf II in Prague funded natural investigations and received alchemists who claimed to transmute. Francesco I de' Medici in Florence maintained workshops that explored minerals, colours, and distillations within princely rooms. Pope John X addressed deceptive claims in a papal bull and instructed clerics to prosecute frauds that exploited the faithful. John Dee and Edward Kelly passed through Central European courts as learned men who mixed mathematics, natural philosophy, and chemical promises, and they relied on noble favour for rooms and protection. Goldsmiths' companies in cities such as London set assay standards and tested plate and coin. Apothecaries and surgeons' groups regulated the sale of distilled waters and preparations. These actors formed a field of support, scrutiny, and negotiation around the art. The progression of patronage often began with a petition. Practitioners sent letters or used intermediaries to request a hearing. They framed work in terms that matched a patron's needs, such as improving mines, refining base metals, or preparing medicines. Small trials followed, held before treasurers, mint assayers, or trusted courtiers. Witnesses weighed metal, observed a projection onto lead, or tasted distilled waters. When demonstrations appeared credible, patrons issued stipends, rooms, and materials. Chanceries recorded privileges that authorized experiments related to coinage or metallurgy, sometimes exempting named persons from general prohibitions. In 1317, Pope John XXII issued Spondent Quas non exhibent, which condemned alchemists who promised results they did not deliver and warned officials against tolerating such fraud. In England, a statute under Henry IV restricted attempts to multiply gold and silver, and later licenses named individuals permitted to experiment under supervision. Cities maintained ordinances that punished false gilding and adulteration while granting guildmasters control over apprentices and recipes. Venice codified privileges for inventions in 1474 and bound glassmakers to secrecy with penalties for carrying techniques abroad. These measures encouraged innovation within approved channels and deterred public claims that could disturb currency or trade. Across regions, the same sequence repeated with local forms and documents. Outcomes followed success, delay, or failure. When a patron saw steady gains in assayed metal or valued preparations, support extended and workshops grew. When trials stalled, oversight tightened and rooms were closed. Edward Kelly was imprisoned under Rudolf II after disputes over performance, and he died while still in custody. Court alchemists in other settings lost protection and departed at short notice when patrons changed or treasuries thinned. Fraud prosecutions proceeded in civic courts against those who sold powders with claims to multiply coin or who altered assay samples. Records noted confiscated equipment and bonds paid for release. Guild enforcement also produced outcomes. Goldsmiths' wardens seized substandard plate and punished members who used false touch marks. Apothecaries restricted the sale of distilled waters to licensed shops. The secrecy of recipes functioned as a shield in this environment. Practitioners maintained notebooks with ciphers and code names for reagents, shared only within small circles bound by oaths. Scribes copied treatises for private libraries rather than public stalls, or they printed with veiled language while maintaining oral instruction for key parts. Courts accepted secrecy when it protected advantage but pressed for disclosure when public money and coin were at stake. Over time, this mixed response reinforced guarded exchange and selective publication. Arrangements varied by religion, law, and economy, and they changed with time. In the Islamic world, court support for scholars and artisans set terms for access to instruments and substances, while jurists discussed the permissibility of claims that touched money. In Latin Christendom, ecclesiastical decrees targeted deception and secular statutes directed work related to mints and trade, and this combined oversight influenced how practitioners framed their requests. In some Protestant territories, town councils and territorial princes assumed roles once shared with bishops, and they issued their own privileges and penalties. Mining states in Central Europe linked metallurgical art to fiscal stability and placed assayers between alchemists and treasuries. Secrecy persisted because it protected livelihoods and because institutions rewarded discreet success. The guarded corridors of courts, the doors of guild rooms, and the sealed notebooks of practitioners defined how knowledge moved and how it paused. Within these bounds, the art continued to seek materials, tests, and proof, while learning to speak carefully to power. The patterns of favor and restraint formed a steady background for later projects and debates, and they remained part of the practical character of alchemy as it entered new settings. Chapter 6: Doctrines, Stages, and Trials of the Philosopher's Stone. The pursuit of the Philosopher's Stone, or lapis philosophorum, shaped alchemical theory and practice for centuries. It joined ideas about the generation of metals with procedures meant to purify and recombine matter until it gained the power to tinge, fix, and increase base metals, bringing them to silver or gold. Writers described a staged journey in which a simple substance passed through corruption, cleansing, and maturation under controlled heat. They named the final agent the elixir, the tincture, or the powder of projection, and they argued that it worked by perfecting the balance of sulfurous and mercurial properties inside the target metal. Lists of operations supplied a curriculum for the workshop, and the color changes served as signs that the course had moved forward. Alongside recipes, authors set out trial methods under fire and acid to judge whether a product truly matched gold in permanence and malleability. The Lapis quest set rules for careful timing, sealed vessels, and exacting tests, and it tied laboratory craft to claims about the hidden order of nature. From the 9th century in the Islamic world through the 16th century in Europe, the Lapis narrative appeared in treatises, commentaries, and recipe books. Its settings included small household workshops, rooms in city quarters near metalworkers, and spaces inside courts where controlled heat and experienced hands were available. Some authors wrote from urban centers with strong minting and assaying traditions, while others wrote from monastic or university towns where books, furnaces, and glassware could be gathered. Manuscripts moved across regions in Arabic and Latin, and later printed books carried folded diagrams of furnaces and vessels into wider circles. Instruments included the athanor for steady heat, glazed earthenware cucurbits, pelicans, and alembics for circulation, and bone ash cupels for assaying. Lids were luted with clay and fibers to keep vapors from escaping. The goal remained similar across places: to carry a prepared matter through a sequence of transformations in a sealed vessel, and to prove its fixing power on molten lead, tin, or copper. Exact locations for many laboratories remained unrecorded, and time spans for individual projects were often stated only in general terms such as months or a year. Some recipes circulated without clear dates. Jabir ibn Hayyan, as presented in Arabic texts, described elixirs grounded in a sulfur and mercury theory of metals. Al-Razi wrote on calcinations, sublimations, and tests that sorted true from false results. In Latin Europe, the author under the name Pseudo-Geber set a standard with the Summa Perfectionis, which taught a sophisticated apparatus and a doctrine of compounds and balances of properties. Albertus Magnus discussed metallic generation and the means by which art could aid nature. Roger Bacon referred to the stone alongside optical and experimental studies. Arnold of Villanova linked elixirs with ideas about medicine and quintessence. The name Ramon Lowell appeared on alchemical texts that promoted systematic orderings of operations, though authorship of several was uncertain. In England, George Ripley organized the 12 gates to chart operations leading to the stone, and Thomas Norton's Ordinal of Alchemy mapped the steps and warned about imposters. The figure, later called Basil Valentine, described anticeremonial processes and the value of fixity, though the person behind the name was unclear. Compendia such as the Rosarium Philosophorum collected images and sayings that reinforced the staged path, and they brought together voices from different places into a shared framework. Textbook doctrines began with a model of how metals grew underground. According to widely read authors, moist vapors condensed into mercury-like and sulfur-like principles that mixed in varied purities to yield lead, tin, iron, copper, silver, or gold. The stone was framed as an artificial medicine that corrected flaws in these mixes by perfecting their balance and driving off combustible impurities. The work usually started from a chosen prima materia, a prepared substance treated as metal seed. It was sealed in a vessel, often called the egg, and placed under steady heat. The mixture underwent calcination to open the body, dissolution to turn it into a blackened broth, and digestion to bring out hidden virtues. Practitioners watched for a black stage called nigredo, a white stage called albedo, a yellowing called citrinitas, and a red stage called rubedo. Operations such as distillation, cohobation, and circulation kept the material moving while the furnace maintained a constant moderate heat. Coagulation and sublimation alternated with solution to refine the matter and render it more subtle and stable. The aim was not to rush the fire but to coax the matter to fixedness, so it would no longer flee from heat. The result, if achieved, was multiplied by repeated solution and coagulation, then fermented with a little gold or silver to prepare it for projection. Projection described the act of casting a pinch of prepared powder onto molten base metal. Recipes told how the powder should be wrapped in wax or placed on a hot coal and flicked into the crucible. A successful projection would change the melt's color and after cooling yield a bead that weighed more than the starting material and could be hammered thin without cracking. Alchemists authenticated such results through assaying. They coupled the bead in bone ash with lead to pull away base metals as oxides. They parted silver from gold using nitric acid, called aqua fortis, and they dissolved resistant gold with aqua regia to see if any portion survived. They scraped the surface across a touchstone and matched streaks against known standards from the mint. They weighed samples to judge density, and they tested resistance to corrosion, amalgamation with mercury, and repeated meltings. Reports described white and red elixirs that worked in different proportions, and they noted that 1 grain of powder could transform many times its weight of metal after multiplication. Outcomes often disappointed. Cementation with corrosive salts could gild copper only on the surface. Alloying could mimic color but fail under the hammer. A few accounts reported repeated success across many assays. Independent confirmations were rare. When princes demanded demonstrations, workshops sometimes improved their procedures, and sometimes disputes ended in penalties. The existence of a universally effective stone remained unproven. Variants of the lapis doctrine described 2 stones. A white stone brought base metals to silver, and a red stone carried them to gold. Some writers treated the stone as a medicine for metals only, while others called it a universal medicine for living bodies, though evidence for such cures was not established. Chinese, Indian, and European traditions all developed forms of elixirs, but their theories and goals differed. Allegorical readings grew around the stages, and some readers treated the color changes as moral or spiritual lessons that paralleled the laboratory. Compilers gathered many voices and arranged them so that operations, colors, and tests formed a path that could be learned and checked by craft standards. The core technical path still emphasized steady heat, sealed vessels, and strict trials with fire and acid. The lapis quest set a disciplined rhythm of stages and proofs that guided alchemical practice into the early modern period. Chapter 7. Paracelsus and the Rise of Iatrochemistry. Medicines of fire described the turn in alchemical practice toward healing, as experimenters recast furnaces and stills as instruments for preparing remedies. The central idea tied chemical separations and recombinations to the needs of the sick, rather than to the perfection of metals. Paracelsus, the physician Theophrastus von Hohenheim, proposed that nature worked through 3 active principles, mercury, sulfur, and salt, and that disease arose from imbalances or corruptions in these principles within the body. He argued that purposeful burning, dissolving, and distilling could strip harmful qualities, draw out hidden virtues, and render potent medicines. This approach took alchemy from the foundry and the transmutation bed to the hospital and the apothecary bench. As recipes shifted from cryptic emblems to dose and solvent, practitioners described tinctures, essences, arcana, and quintessences meant to target specific ailments. They taught that poisons could become cures if properly separated, purified, and measured, and that chemical work could shorten long cooking and fermentation. The craft thus adopted a new identity, often called spagyric or iatrochemical, that promised reliable preparations aimed at defined diseases. The setting lay in the German-speaking lands, the Swiss cantons, and northern Italy during the 16th century. when printing houses in Basel, Strasbourg and Cologne spread medical news quickly. City councils regulated apothecaries, licensed surgeons, and monitored street healers, and these authorities also judged the new chemical drugs. University faculties in Basel, Wittenberg, and Padua debated the place of distillation and minerals in therapy, while court pharmacies and noble gardens created small laboratories for waters, spirits and oils. Mines in Tyrol, Saxony and Bohemia supplied vitriol, sulfur, saltpeter, antimony and mercury, and miners' ailments offered cases for new remedies. War, plague, and the spread of the French disease, later called syphilis, created demand for strong medicines that acted quickly and did not require long courses of diet. The Reformation also altered patronage and doctrine, opening spaces for physicians who challenged traditional authorities. The precise routes of some texts and instruments across borders remained undocumented. The overall environment favored experiment, argument, and the search for preparation methods that officials could standardize and patients could tolerate. Paracelsus stood at the center of this shift. Born as Theophrastus von Hohenheim, he trained as a physician-surgeon and later wrote in both Latin and German. He promoted the tria prima mercury for volatility and metallic nature, sulfur for combustibility and oily character, and salt for fixity and solidity, as guiding principles for both substances and diseases. Editors such as Adam von Bodenstein and Johannes Huser later gathered and published his scattered writings, which helped shape his posthumous reputation. Supporters included Oswald Kroll, who compiled Chemical Pharmacology, and Joseph Duchesne, known as Quercetanus, who promoted the new medicines in France. Critics such as Thomas Erastus attacked his theology and alleged rash practice, while Andreas Libavius opposed parts of his doctrine yet embraced clear laboratory method and instruction. Johann Hartmann became a professor of chymitria at Marburg, teaching chemical pharmacy within a university framework. Valerius Cordus, although not a Paracelsian in doctrine, prepared official dispensatories that incorporated distilled preparations. A later figure, Jan Baptist van Helmont, built on medical chemistry with new concepts and would extend the program into the 17th century. Key episodes in Paracelsus's career illustrated the practical program of iatrochemistry. As a city physician in Basel in 1527, he lectured publicly and rejected the authority of Galen and Avicenna, insisting that medicine must draw on experience, minerals and fire. Contemporary reports stated that he symbolically burned traditional medical texts, which signaled his break with scholastic learning. He traveled among mining regions and observed smelting and assaying, linking operations in the furnace to operations in the body. In treatises such as the Paragranum and the Opus Paramirum, he claimed that disease entities had specific causes and required targeted remedies. He described spagyric practice as separating the pure from the impure and recombining the purified parts, with the aim of producing a quintessence free of harmful admixtures. His surgical writings, including the Great Surgery Book, offered case-based notes on wounds and infections. He prescribed tinctures and essences made by macerating plant or mineral matter in wine spirits, distilling and calcining residues to recover salts for recombination. He held that a substance could be poison or remedy depending on the dose, so careful measurement became central to his medicine. The exact composition of his laudanum remained unclear in surviving notes. The program advanced through print, controversy and workshop practice. In German cities, printers released collections of Paracelsian writings that emphasized new remedies for the French disease, fevers and plague. Apothecaries built separate furnaces for distillation and sublimation, producing aqua fortis, oil of vitriol, spirit of wine and other solvents used to extract active parts. The Nuremberg dispensatory, compiled by Valerius Cordus in 1546, described standardized preparations of distilled waters and tinctures, which signaled official acceptance of some chemical methods. The antimony debate grew as physicians administered emetic and sudorific antimonial preparations. French faculties condemned them at intervals, and later reversed course after further trials. Oswald Kroll's Basilica Chymica catalogued spagyric medicines and promoted signatures and specifics, shaping practice for physicians and apothecaries. Andreas Libavius's Alchemia offered clear descriptions of furnaces, alembics and salts while attacking Paracelsian metaphysics and defending regulated pharmacy. John Begin's Tyrocinium Chymicum presented a classroom sequence for chemical operations used in medicine. University chairs in places such as Marburg and later Gießen taught chemical pharmacy, and court laboratories in Prague, Kassel, and Dresden supported dedicated practitioners. Hospital wards saw trials of mineral medicines alongside traditional herb simples, and town statutes began to list chemical drugs among approved remedies. Details of these trials were often incomplete in the records. Nitrochemistry appeared within a varied cultural field that included natural magic, traditional apothecary craft, and scholastic physics. Catholic and Protestant courts both patronized chemical healers, and monastic pharmacies continued to distill waters while adapting selected mineral preparations. Pseudonymous authorities such as Basil Valentine supplied language and recipes for antimony that Paracelsians adapted to new indications. Some physicians maintained humoral diagnoses while adding chemical correctives, and others adopted Paracelsus's disease entities with little of his theology. Translations and abridgments shaped what readers learned as Paracelsus's doctrine, and editors sometimes altered sequences or attributions to fit local needs. The movement drew strength from miners, soldiers, and travelers who demanded concentrated portable medicines, and from civic officials who pressed for reproducible preparations. The result blended workshop skill, theoretical claims about the tria prima, and the growing habit of testing by dose and observation. By the early 17th century, chemical pharmacy had secured a place in learned medicine and in municipal regulation, and practitioners carried its tools forward into new forms of experiment. Chapter 8. Experiment and skepticism in the workshops of early modern chemistry. Experiment and skepticism shaped early modern chemistry as practitioners refined procedures, tested claims, and reconsidered the purposes of their art. The grand aims of transmutation and universal medicine did not disappear, but they met a culture of cautious assessment that emphasized trials, records, and critical reading. Figures who worked across the 17th century arranged furnaces, balances, and glasses with more regularity, and they described their methods with greater care. They accepted the value of secrecy where reputation or patronage demanded it, yet they also explored new pathways for sharing results through print and learned correspondence. The combination created a mixed world of guarded recipes and public experiments, where skepticism served both as a shield against error and as a method for discovery. Through this steady pressure, alchemy shifted toward chemistry. Even as many instruments and aims remained familiar to earlier generations of practitioners, the atmosphere of inquiry turned measured and comparative, and it set a practical foundation for later changes in theory and language. The settings of this change stretched from Central Europe to the British Isles and the Low Countries, and they extended into Italian and German cities where artisans and physicians had long worked with metals, minerals, and medicines. Rural manors housed quiet laboratories beside kitchens and still rooms, while urban neighborhoods filled with apothecaries and metallurgists who maintained hot furnaces and sharp odors of acids and oils. Printing presses in Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg put chemical manuals into wider circulation, and manuscript copies continued to pass through hands in coded or abbreviated forms. Formal institutions emerged in some places, most notably the Royal Society in London after 1660, where experiments were described and witnessed under regular rules. Universities taught traditional philosophies, but they also hosted demonstrations of furnaces and distillations, often in private rooms attached to medical faculties. The political landscape shifted with wars and settlements which affected supply chains for minerals and glass, and these constraints influenced which experiments could be pursued. In this network of workshops and meeting rooms, the tempo of chemical work grew more regular and more visible. Several figures helped define this experimental turn and its skeptical posture. Robert Boyle served as a natural philosopher and chemist who combined hands-on experiments with careful arguments against inherited elemental doctrines. George Starkey, born in Bermuda and trained in New England, worked in London as a skilled operator and author, often writing under the name Arrhenius Philolathus. Michael Sendivogius, a Polish-Lithuanian nobleman and author, wrote works on niter and the aerial spirit that later readers studied closely. Jan Baptista van Helmont, based in the Spanish Netherlands, introduced the term gas and argued for new ways of thinking about matter and fermentation. Johann Rudolf Glauber developed practical methods for making mineral acids and described useful salts, including the sal mirabile, later known as sodium sulfate. Isaac Newton, best known for mathematics and natural philosophy, also conducted long chemical investigations and copied many alchemical texts. Each of these figures connected with others through correspondence, patrons, or shared texts, and their relationships often mixed collaboration with rivalry. Authorship in this period could be obscure, and attributions of some treatises remained uncertain, but the influence of these names shaped practices across several decades. Early in the century, Sendivogius framed ideas about niter and the life-sustaining component of air, claiming that a subtle substance permeated the atmosphere and nourished growth. Readers drew practical lessons from his instructions on purifying salpeter and working with volatile spirits. Around the same time, Van Helmont described experiments that produced new airs from burning or dissolving substances, and he called these wafting bodies gases. His writings proposed a more active and fermenting matter than traditional theory allowed, and he recommended careful attention to the behavior of acids and alkalis. Glauber, working in German lands and the Low Countries, published recipes for making strong acids from vitriol and saltpeter, and he recorded the preparation of useful salts that improved dyeing, glass-making, and medicine. These authors introduced procedures that could be repeated with recognizable results, and their books circulated in Latin and vernacular editions. With these precedents, Starkey arrived in England in the 1650s and built furnaces suited to fine control of heat. He advised patrons and sought to reconcile philosophical ambitions with reliable laboratory work, while his pseudonymous writings offered both guidance and riddles to readers. Boyle studied Starkey's techniques and read Sendivogius and Van Helmont, then tested their claims with his own apparatus. He argued in The Sceptical Chymist that the four elements and the Paracelsian Triaprima did not explain observed changes, proposing instead a corpuscular philosophy that treated materials as clusters of small particles with mechanical properties. He extended this approach in treatises on forms, qualities, and colors, where he showed how vegetable infusions could indicate acidity or alkalinity, and he described careful filtration, precipitation, and crystallization as tools for analysis. He helped cultivate practices of open demonstration within learned gatherings, yet he also kept parts of his alchemical work private, including steps related to sophisticated mercuries. In the late 1680s, Boyle petitioned for the repeal of an Old English statute against multiplying precious metals, and Parliament removed the restriction in 1689. Newton read Starkey and Sendivogius with great care, and he worked on the preparation of special mercuries and philosophical salts in long sequences of trials. He folded chemical ideas into reflections on attraction and reaction, and he later applied assay skills in public service when he supervised coinage. Hennig Brand distilled large quantities of urine and isolated phosphorus around 1669, a result that showed how patient processing of common materials could yield striking new substances. These developments pressed chemistry toward classification, measurement, and shared tests, even when authors guarded some steps. The culture of skepticism that formed around these practices varied by region and by community. In some cities, censors and guilds limited the circulation of books and instruments, while in others, patrons encouraged publication and demonstration. The authorship of certain Philalethes treatises remained disputed, though many attributions now favor Starkey's hand where manuscript evidence survives. Some of Newton's laboratory notebooks were lost, and their full contents were unknown. The balance between secrecy and openness produced layered texts, where clear instructions for furnaces and solvents appeared beside coded references to philosophical agents. Over time, chymists placed more weight on the stability of procedures and on the ability of peers to repeat and witness them under similar conditions. They accepted that many older doctrines could not account for consistent outcomes in experiments with airs, acids, and salts. As the 17th century closed, the field held new habits of comparison and record-keeping that prepared investigators to redraw the map of elements and combustion. The transition moved gradually, and it carried older aims into a language better suited to measured change. Chapter 9. From Phlogiston to Oxygen in the Age of Airs and Scales. 18th century chemistry replaced the old language of principles and metallic seeds with a new account of elements, air, and combustion. The shift began as a debate over why substances burned and why metals formed calxes when heated. Advocates of phlogiston argued that combustible bodies contained a fire-like principle that escaped during burning. Critics measured gains of weight and suspected that something entered from the air. Through careful experiments, new gases were collected and described, and the parts of air were separated and named. At the center, a program of exact weighing turned reactions into balances of matter. Antoine Laurent Lavoisier introduced oxygen as the partner in combustion, and redefined an element as a substance not yet decomposed by any known means. He and his collaborators created a shared nomenclature that linked names to composition. Alchemy's aims were recast into analysis, composition, and measurable change. By the end of the century, combustion, calcination, and acids were explained with oxygen rather than phlogiston, and the older terms lost public authority. The change did not erase older practices, but it offered a new map of materials and reactions that guided the next century. The changes unfolded across laboratories, lecture rooms, and workshops in Europe during the 1700s. In German universities such as Halle, teachers shaped an early 18th century curriculum that featured phlogiston. In Scotland, medical schools and city lectures in Edinburgh and Glasgow supported careful quantitative teaching. In England, instrument makers supplied glassware and balances to private laboratories in London and provincial towns. In Leeds and later Birmingham, dissenting academies and industrial circles encouraged experimental study of airs. In Sweden, assay houses and apothecaries in Uppsala and Köping refined mineral analysis. In Paris, the Arsenal Laboratory and the Paris Academy of Sciences provided space and patrons for controlled trials with sealed vessels, balances, and ice calorimeters. New tools such as the pneumatic trough and eudiometer allowed gases to be captured and compared. Print shops in Paris, London, and Stockholm issued textbooks, tables, and chemical dictionaries that spread methods and terms. Museums and learned societies collected apparatus and samples, and their proceedings recorded debates. The geography of the transformation was mixed, but its tools were similar. Furnaces, retorts, bell jars, balances, and records kept with tables of numbers. Several figures anchored the debate and connected communities that once spoke the language of alchemy to a new chemical vocabulary. Johann Joachim Becher sketched a theory of earthy principles, and Georg Ernst Stahl developed phlogiston to explain combustion and calcination. Joseph Black identified fixed air as a distinct gas and used the balance to clarify processes like limestone burning and magnesia absorption, demonstrating careful material accounting. Stephen Hales refined techniques to collect airs over water and inspired later pneumatic work. Henry Cavendish produced inflammable air and measured its properties with precision instruments. Joseph Priestley prepared dephlogisticated air and wrote clear accounts that reached broad readers, while maintaining a phlogiston interpretation. Carl Wilhelm Scheele, working in pharmacies and laboratories, isolated several gases and described them with direct observations. Antoine Laurent Lavoisier, supported by French institutions, argued that oxygen combined with metals and combustibles, and he coordinated a team that included Louis-Bernard Guyton de Morveau, Claude-Louis Berthollet, and Antoine-François de Fourcroy to create new names and teaching materials. Pierre-Simon Laplace collaborated with Lavoisier on calorimetry. Torben Bergman organized affinity tables that summarize observed combinations. Richard Kirwan defended phlogiston in print, and later conceded to the oxygen framework after critiques. Their correspondence, reviews, and public demonstrations linked arguments to measurements and helped establish shared standards. The progression began with the phlogiston view as a practical language that joined older chemistry to early modern craft. According to Stahl's account, combustible bodies released phlogiston when burned, and metals were calcus combined with this principle. Reduction restored phlogiston to the calcus and produced the metal again. Early pneumatic chemistry challenged this, when Black distinguished fixed air from common air and showed that it was produced in predictable amounts. Hales's devices allowed experimenters to trap gases, measure volumes, and compare properties such as solubility and flammability. Cavendish prepared inflammable air by acting acids on metals and noted its lightness and heat in burning. Priestley heated red calcas and collected a gas that supported bright combustion, and he interpreted it within phlogiston terms as dephlogisticated air. Scheele described fire air and foul air from careful reactions, though his publications appeared after some announcements in France and England. Lavoisier repeated calcinations in sealed vessels with balances, noted mass increases, and argued that a part of the air combined with the heated substance. He burned phosphorus and sulfur in confined air and tracked the disappearance of a fraction while an acid product appeared. These results allowed him to propose that oxygen was the active part of air in combustion and calcination. Once oxygen was identified as the partner in burning and metallic calcination, related processes were reorganized. Lavoisier and Laplace built an ice calorimeter to measure heat released and absorbed, giving numbers to reactions and respiration. Cavendish showed that combining inflammable air with oxygen produced pure water, and debates followed over priority and interpretation. Lavoisier presented water as a compound of oxygen with inflammable air, which he renamed hydrogen. He argued that acids derived their character from oxygen, a view that guided the first naming system even though later research revised it. The Méthode de nomenclature chimique, in 1787, renamed substances by composition and introduced endings like minus and -ic for acid strength, while the Traité élémentaire de chimie, in 1789, defined elements operationally and organized laboratory practice. Berthollet explored reversible combinations and the influence of mass on reactions, and Proust argued for definite proportions in compounds. Their debate framed early stoichiometry. Bergman's tables of affinities were reinterpreted through the new language. Industrial and administrative work such as saltpeter refining, dye synthesis, and mineral acinyl adopted the balance and the new terms. By the century's end, many universities and societies taught oxygen chemistry, and phlogiston declined, though it persisted in some classrooms and journals for a time. Adoption varied by region and institution, and older and newer schemas overlapped for decades. Some German and Swedish chemists kept phlogiston explanations while using the new experimental tools. Irish and British writers, such as Kirwan, revised positions as critiques accumulated. Political upheaval in France affected institutions. Lavoisier was executed in 1794 during the Revolution, but his papers and collaborators continued the program. Printed tables, dictionaries and translation projects stabilized the vocabulary, though national terms and spellings differed. Exact dates of some laboratory trials are not firmly established. Over time, laws of conservation of mass and definite proportions anchored instruction, and the idea of elements as undecomposed substances guided practice until atomic theories at the turn of the 19th century added a deeper model. Alchemy's hopes for transmutation moved to the margins, while its apparatus, purification techniques and careful record-keeping remained part of the chemical craft. The reimagining of elements in the 18th century set the frame for later inquiry and gave enduring form to the study of matter. Chapter 10. Techniques, Symbols, and Memory. From Furnace to Archive, Afterlives of Alchemy described how its practices, signs and stories continued long after chemistry defined new theories and standards. Techniques that once served the search for transmutation remained in distilleries, dye works and pharmacies. Symbols that once marked metals and planets moved into printed emblems, bookplates and academic seals. Scholars turned old treatises into readable texts, and experimenters rebuilt procedures to understand how past recipes had worked. Museums and libraries kept apparatus, notebooks and illustrated scrolls so that materials and images did not disappear. Modern readers encountered alchemy in novels, paintings and films, while specialized communities studied it as a branch of esoteric tradition. The result formed a broad landscape in which laboratory knowledge, cultural meaning, and historical interpretation met and reshaped one another. The afterlives did not match the older hope for a philosopher's stone. They preserved methods and languages that had proved useful, and they kept traces of an older ambition inside new frames. Each strand linked back to furnaces, vessels, and cautious operations, even as the goals and explanations changed. The endurance of these strands showed how crafts and symbols could detach from earlier doctrines and find stable places in later centuries. The setting extended from 19th century cities, where occult societies and new public museums grew, to 20th and 21st century universities and archives. Major collections appeared in London, Paris, Amsterdam and Philadelphia, with manuscript rooms and galleries that stored alchemical writings and instruments. The Warburg Institute gathered materials on Renaissance images and thought. The Bibliotheca Philosophica Hermetica in Amsterdam held printed and manuscript works on hermetic and alchemical traditions. The Wellcome collections in London preserved medical and chemical artifacts, while the Science History Institute in Philadelphia curated laboratory glassware and furnaces alongside modern chemical instruments. Digital projects made scans of notebooks and recipes accessible to researchers who could not travel. Reconstruction laboratories in academic history of science programs set up benches with retorts, cucurbits and alembics so that old procedures could be tested under controlled conditions. Outside universities, craft distilleries and perfume workshops continued to use fractional distillation, maceration, and extraction processes that had earlier alchemical forms. The time frame stretched into the present, where conferences, exhibitions, and online catalogues allowed materials and debates to circulate with steady accessibility. Principal figures included several strands that intersected. Occult revivalists, such as Eliphas Levi and Gerard Ancourse, promoted alchemy as a symbolic discipline within modern esotericism. Members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and later Aleister Crowley, drew on alchemical imagery for ritual systems. Psychologist Carl Gustav Jung studied alchemical texts as archives of imagery for the unconscious mind, and presented them as a historical language of transformation. Historian Mircea Eliade linked metallurgical and alchemical practices to wider patterns in religious history. Francis Yates placed Hermetic sources and Rosicrucian literature into narratives of early modern thought. A later generation of historians, including Lawrence M. Principe, William R. Newman, Pamela H. Smith, Tara Numadal, and Bruce T. Moran, read technical treatises closely and combined philology with laboratory reconstruction. Curators and conservators worked with them to identify apparatus, pigments, and binders in museum objects. Experimental historians formed teams where chemists and historians collaborated to follow recipes step by step. Their relationships tied libraries, labs, and galleries into a network where texts informed experiments and experiments clarified texts. Each group focused on a different dimension, yet they shared the aim of understanding practice rather than repeating legends. Key developments began with a 19th century shift that gave alchemy new homes. Occult societies adopted it as a symbolic and initiatory art, printing manuals that synthesized medieval and early modern sources into modern handbooks. Public museums collected furnaces, glassware, and manuscripts as part of the broader history of science and medicine. In the early 20th century, Jung's Psychology and Alchemy encouraged readers to treat images and sequences in the texts as reflections of psychic processes. Eliade and Yates then placed alchemical themes within learned culture and the history of ideas. Meanwhile, many chemists treated alchemy as a mistaken prelude, but a minority kept curiosity about its laboratory content. Catalogers prepared descriptive lists of manuscripts and incunabula that helped identify authorship, dates, and versions. After mid-century, the growth of history of science as an academic field supported specialized courses and conferences. By the 1980s and 1990s, historians and chemists began to rebuild procedures using period-appropriate materials, ventilation, and safety methods. These reconstructions formed a new stage in which practical outcomes, such as the colors of glass or the yields of distillations, could be measured and repeated. The approach moved alchemy from legend toward replicable study. Further work produced outcomes that reshaped understanding. Critical editions clarified attributions, separated composite texts, and dated revisions. Digital archives, including projects dedicated to Isaac Newton's alchemical papers, provided transcriptions, translations, and images that allowed careful comparison of notes and sources. Reconstructions showed how operators produced strong mineral acids, phosphorus-rich flames, and mercurial amalgams with pre-modern apparatus. Replicated cementation and parting procedures explained older claims of refining and color changes in metals, without implying creation of new matter. Experimental series reproduced pigments such as vermilion and smalt, the gilding of surfaces by amalgamation, and the glassmaker's gold ruby and copper ruby colors. These results demonstrated that many recipes were practical crafts aimed at dyes, medicines, and materials, even when encased in philosophical language. At the same time, legal frameworks and medical regulations in modern states limited any repetition of hazardous metallic medicines. Vocabulary that began in alchemical practice, such as alcohol, alkali, elixir, and tincture, remained in everyday and technical speech. Distillation plants, pharmaceutical laboratories, and flavor houses continued processes that matched older operations under new names and industrial controls. The cultural memory of alchemy spread through exhibitions, novels, films, and visual arts that reused emblematic images with steady familiarity. Across regions, related traditions shaped parallel studies. Researchers examined South and East Asian sources on Rasayana and Waidan or Nidan, alongside European materials to compare practices and concepts, though each had distinct histories. Private practitioners continued esoteric forms inspired by early modern texts, while historians and conservators concentrated on documentation, replication, and preservation. Museum displays presented furnaces, manuscripts, and emblem books as part of the shared heritage of science and craft. University programs trained students to read recipes, identify apparatus, and assess outcomes with careful measurement. Variants of interpretation remained, ranging from psychological readings to technical reconstructions, but they coexisted within an expanding archive. The afterlives of alchemy settled into the present as a set of techniques and symbols with stable uses, a field of scholarship with maturing methods, and a cultural memory that kept older ambitions visible. The old language of furnaces, vessels, and signs persisted quietly in laboratories, libraries, and workshops, where it continued to inform careful work and reflective histories. And so, dear knight, our tale of alchemy draws to a close. May your rest be peaceful, your dreams alight with wonder, and until our next gathering, ride bravely into the night,